My name is Dr. Kevin Chapman, and I'm an Andrew Kukas Foundation for Social Anxiety Mental Health Advisory Board member. And today we'll discuss the topic of love and relationships. Is it just butterflies or is it social anxiety? So that's what we're going to talk about. And if at any time during the discussion you have questions, just please submit it through the Periscope app so I can address it during this broadcast. Or you can just type it into the box. And we'll go ahead and get started. So with that being said, this topic's interesting because, of course, it's February and Valentine's Day is right around the corner. So many times we wonder the effects of social anxiety that has on romantic relationships. And, before I jump into that, I just kind of want to remind you of what we talked about last time. Last time in the first scope that we did for the Andrew Kukas Foundation, we talked about CBT and how it works for social anxiety, but we talked a lot about the myths associated with CBT. So we talked about the three parts of CBT, the way it relates to social anxiety, and we also talked about the three parts of social anxiety. So the three parts of social anxiety include, of course, the thoughts, the feelings of anxiety, and the physiological arousal associated with it, and then behavior. And then we talked about the three parts or the three components of treatment, which are cognitive restructuring, which is relevant to today's discussion, systematic graduated exposure, so in other words, gradually confronting socially anxiety-provoking situations, and then, of course, a term that most people don't like, and that's homework. And homework, of course, in this context is a lot different than what we normally talk about. So the way that's related today is, again, is it just butterflies or is it social anxiety? So I guess I'll start out by saying, since this is the month of love, so to speak, we need to talk about that. So I guess the short answer of that is that it's an interaction of both. And what do I mean by is it an interaction of both? So, if you think about social anxiety, we talked about this in the last scope. We all have social anxiety. So it's not a matter of whether or not we have it or we don't have it. It's a matter of whether or not the social anxiety impairs our functioning. So in the case of seeking out romantic relationships and social anxiety, obviously the first point I'll make is that it's completely normal to be concerned about romantic relationships. It's a part of our society, it's a part of our being, and for the most part, most people want to belong, have a sense of belongingness to other people. So a romantic relationship's no exception to that. So it makes complete sense that it's normal to be somewhat anxious about pursuing one. So with that being said, though, people who are prone to chronic social anxiety, have often learned to view relationships as not possible or extremely difficult for them, right? So in other words, in many ways, it's normal to be anxious about pursuing a relationship. Most people would be, if we're honest about it. But social anxiety gives us a different filter through which to view relationships. So in other words, if I'm prone to social anxiety, I tend to view those relationships as just not possible. It's not for me, and it will go poorly. And I'll give you some information about that in a second. So in many ways, if I'm socially anxious, and when it comes to relationships, this typically is going to facilitate avoidance behavior of relationships. So in other words, I'm going to continue to avoid relationships, which because of that, if I'm socially anxious, I'm going to avoid relationships because it's going to stimulate me to think, well, I'm going to fail at it anyway. People aren't going to be able to, really understand me, and it's probably not going to, it's going to go poorly. So therefore, I'm going to tend to avoid those situations. Another one is about reinforcing this idea of being unlovable, right? So if I'm unlovable, then why would I pursue a relationship? So I'm going to avoid a relationship many times when I'm socially anxious because I have this underlying idea that I'm not lovable, right? And another aspect of being socially anxious and trying to pursue a relationship would be this idea of what we call negative affect. And negative affect is linked to depression, is linked to anxiety, is linked to social anxiety, and people often share this idea of negative affect when they're socially anxious. In fact, social anxiety, of all the anxiety disorders, has the most unique relationship with depression when it comes to experiencing positive emotion. So because of that, if I avoid social relationships, especially romantic ones, I'm probably going to feel more distressed, which of course in turn makes me feel more depressed. So with that being said, how do I get out of that way of thinking, particularly when it relates to romantic relationships? So if we think about it that way, here's kind of the bottom line. It's not the event itself. In other words, it's not the relationship or the pursuit of the relationship or potential rejection that's the problem. It's my interpretation of that that's the problem. And many times when we're socially anxious, we tend to interpret those events or relationships in a way that's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, so to speak, right? So, in other words, there's a colleague of mine, her name is Deb Hope, and she treats a lot of social anxiety. She's at the University of Nebraska, and she has a treatment manual for treating social anxiety called Mastering Your Social Anxiety. And in there, she talks about 3 dysfunctional thinking patterns that people with social anxiety have, and this is no different than affecting relationships in a pretty negative way. So in other words, these 3 dysfunctional thinking patterns, some of which, not all necessarily, but many of these dysfunctional thinking patterns will contribute to avoidance of social relationships and romantic relationships. So the first type of pattern that tends to affect whether or not we pursue a romantic relationship is what we call an external locus of control. And what that really means is, if I'm socially anxious, I tend to think that other people have more of what it takes to make a situation occur or make someone go on a date with me or to say the things I want them to say more so than I can. In other words, you have better skills than I do, and this person can say the right things. I, on the other hand, cannot. So in other words, there's this idea that I can't control what's going to happen in a potentially romantic relationship, and therefore I tend to avoid them. So that's called an external locus of control. The second dysfunctional thinking pattern that we have to learn to change, and I think everybody can certainly aid me in this one, and that is what we call perfectionistic standards, because none of us have that, right? Perfectionistic standards. And the way that relates to social anxiety, particularly in pursuing a romantic relationship, is either I have to be perfect in the relationship or when I pursue the relationship, or other people expect me to be perfect. Now, we know no one's perfect, but if I have the preconceived notion that I can't have any what I call ums or uhs when I'm talking to someone, then that's going to ruin the interaction. That's simply not true. No one has a perfect social interaction, but if I have this idea that I either have to be perfect or people expect me to be, then that's going to sabotage me pursuing that relationship as well. The third type of dysfunctional thinking pattern that's described there is what we call a low self-efficacy belief. That's another way to describe confidence, and there's 2 types of that. So low self-efficacy. In other words, I just don't have what it takes in pursuing the relationship. And keep in mind, we're talking social anxiety, not social skills. And of course, many of us who have social anxiety have very good social skills. So it's not a lack of skills or a deficit. It's more so I believe that I don't have what it takes to say the right things in the relationship. Another way to look at that as well is, even if I do say the right things, it simply won't go well. In other words, I can say all the right things, I can do my part, so to speak, but even still, it's going to turn out poorly. Okay? So let me give you an example of that. So for instance, let's say Joe and Mike. So Joe has normal levels of social anxiety, right? And Mike has very high levels of social anxiety. And let's say they're in a new town and they're interested in dating. Okay? So let's say that they see a potential relationship. They see a woman that's at a mailbox and they're at an apartment complex. And Joe decides he's going to say something to the woman. So he says hello, and the woman kind of says hi, and she starts sorting through her mail. So she just acknowledges him, but doesn't say anything else. Well, Joe will probably, or many times, interpret that as, well, she does look busy, or she is dressed up. I wonder if she came from work. I have to try harder. Maybe I am bothering her. She's never met me, so I'll have to say something about the weather, right? So in other words, Joe's interpretation is not personalizing or blaming himself. It's simply acknowledging that, well, she is busy, she is dressed up, I'll have to say something else and see what happens from there. That would be normal levels of social anxiety and an interpretation that's flexible. On the other hand, Mike, who has very high social anxiety, may be in the same scenario, but interpret the brief pause in the as she sorts through her mail again as a sign that he's incompetent. A sign that, well, she clearly doesn't want to be bothered. Clearly I'm going to screw this up. Clearly I'm not attractive, or whatever it may be. So if that's the case, that's going to influence Mike's feelings of anxiety, which is probably going to lead to avoidance behavior. So unfortunately for Mike, that might lead to further avoidance behavior, and it would decrease the likelihood that he would pursue a similar situation in the past. So notice it wasn't what happened in the situation, it was the interpretation of what took place. So with that said, I guess in some tips there, I guess in conclusion would be the following. It's normal to feel anxious about pursuing relationships. I think that's extremely important, and it's related to the second point I want to make. So first of all, it's normal to feel anxious about pursuing relationships. The second piece that I'd point out is to be non-judgmental about the anxiety. Anxiety communicates potential threat about the future, and in the case of social anxiety in relationships, it's about avoiding looking foolish. So in that case, it makes sense to be anxious about doing something new, particularly if you're pursuing a relationship. But if I judge that anxiety as a sign of threat or danger, then that's going to decrease the likelihood that I engage in the appropriate action. So be non-judgmental about the anxiety in pursuing a relationship. The third piece, and my favorite probably, is engage in flexible ways of thinking. It's not necessary to engage in simply positive ways of thinking, right? Well, just think positively. Oh, don't think about it that way. Flexibility is important in thinking, right? Like in the case of Joe and Mike, well, she does look dressed up. Maybe I am bothering her, but I'll have to try harder. It's acknowledging that in reality, there are some things that work out, there are some things that don't. But if I'm flexible in my understanding of what may or may not be happening, that can always be helpful as well. And then finally, remember that thoughts sabotage our emotional experiences. So thoughts really are what make or break our experiences, and our behavior is always going to follow what we say to ourselves. So in sum, there's always an interaction between whether or not there's butterflies when we're trying to pursue a relationship, and if we have social anxiety. They do go hand in hand, but let's not let our thoughts sabotage that experience. So with that being said, thank you for tuning in to the Andrew Kukas Foundation's Periscope support series today. I'd just like to say that, again, I'm Kevin Chapman, and on behalf of the Andrew Kukas Foundation for Social Anxiety, if you'd like to connect with me about any of the information we discussed today, you can reach me at lkevinchapman@icloud.com, all one word, lkevinchapman@icloud.com. And for more information and resources about social anxiety, please visit AKFSA.org and follow AKFSA on Facebook and Twitter. You can always find me on Twitter as well. My handle is at Dr. Kchap, so DRKCHAP, and look for regular updates, and we're going to post this as well on Facebook. Thank you guys for tuning in, and look for the next series that we have next month. Thank you.